Hi friends, it's Chari. Today I have a fun card that is a monochromatic color scheme using the new How You Bean Seashell add-on. So for this card, I will be using those individual shells in the stamp set, not that pile of shells. And I'll be cutting the background with the Simply Stripes Portrait Backdrop die. I'll be cutting this from some white wood grain cardstock to have kind of a fun, beachy look of like a lap board siding. So I've just cut a square that's slightly bigger than my die, and I'll run this through my die cut machine. And then I am going to be sure to keep my stripes in the order in which they were cut, just because the wood grain kind of matches up on these. So you can see I have them laid there in the same order in which the die cut them. And then I'm going to do a little bit of distressing to these. So I've pulled out my Lost Shadow Distress ink. This is a very pale gray. And I am going to go in with a very light hand and just add a little bit of that gray to the edges, which hopefully you can see a little bit here on camera. It is very light. In just a minute, I will hold up this one right here that I've inked beside one that I haven't, so that you can kind of see the difference. So the one on the right has not been inked and the one on the left has been. Then I'm just speeding this up a little bit so you can see my process. You can see I have a few darker spaces, some lighter spaces. I'm doing both sides so that when these are layered beside each other, the inking is not going to match. You're going to have some dark spots beside some light spots, and that is the look that I want to go for. So you can see there how those are kind of distressed a little bit. And then I am going ahead and putting these onto a card base. So I've just put some really strong adhesive around all four sides and then 3 lines down the center. And I'm starting at the top of my card and I'm just stacking these one right after the other in the order in which I've kept them. And then you can see when these are together like this, you can see how the inking on the edges is different between the pieces, and it gives it that look of like the lap siding of a house, of a beach house. Now for my sentiment, I've pulled out Henry's ABCs and I've cut out the letters to spell the word shallow. So the sentiment in this set says, just wanted to say shallow, and I will be white embossing the first part of the sentiment, and I will not be embossing the word shallow because I used my die cuts for that part. So you can see I have inked just the beginning part of the sentiment onto some blue Jay Cardstock with some clear embossing ink, added my white embossing powder, and now I'm heating it up with my heat tools so I get that nice bright white sentiment once it is melted. Then I'll just take this to my paper trimmer and trim this down until I have a little rectangular banner where my sentiment is. So I'm trimming off the top and the bottom, and then for the length I will just trim this with my scissors. Now I'm taking my letters and I'm lining them up on my grid mat to get them nice and straight and evenly spaced. Now there is not a die that cuts a little like dash mark to go between the L and the O, so I just cut an I and then I'm going to trim it off to where I have a little dash to go between the L and the O. Once I have these spaced pretty well, I'm using my ruler to bump up against the bottom to make sure they're nice and straight. And then I can take a piece of, this is removable Scotch tape. I like this for letters like this because it's clear and I can see through it. And that will just hold them in place when I put them on my card base. I'm not putting them on just yet. I'm kind of looking at this to see what the spacing is going to look like. Now I'm moving on to the shells, and this is a really fun technique to color some shells quickly by white embossing them on some colored cardstock. So I need a bunch of shells, so I'm putting them all on the block together. I've already prepped this piece of mermaid cardstock with some anti-static powder. I'm stamping them in some clear embossing ink, and then I will add the white embossing powder. Then I can heat this up with my heat tool and I'll have some bright white shells on that mermaid cardstock. So they are already colored in that pretty mermaid color. And you could leave them like this, but I am going to show you how to add a little bit of inking and a little bit of pencil detail to give them some more interest and depth. I've kept them on that block just as I had them before, and I'm going to stamp another set of these. I need at least 2 of each design, so I'm stamping a bunch of shells, and I will end up using most of these. I had a few extra at the end. But I just think this is a really fun look with that white embossing on colored cardstock, and it's a technique that I don't remember to do all the time, but when I do remember to do it, you get a fun, unique look. So I'll just take the coordinating dies for all of these shells and go ahead and cut all of these shells out, and then I will do my coloring once they're die cut. So now you can see I have all my shells cut out, and I'm taking some Peacock Feathers Distress Oxide ink and a really small brush and just adding some darker teal color kind of to the bottom of them. There's really no rhyme or reason. I'm just kind of doing it to one side. And then you can see I'm going in with a clean paper towel and just buffing away the ink that is on top of my embossing. So you can easily just buff that away with a dry paper towel and you get that bright white back on your shell. So I'm speeding it up so you can see how I did this to all of these shells. I did them sort of in sets, so I'd take the ones that were all the same shape and ink them the same, and then I'd move on to the next shape. And I'm really not worried about shadows or shading. I just want that two-tone effect in the background color of the shells. Now I've pulled out my pencils and I pulled out 2 colors that are a little bit darker than my mermaid cardstock, but still that same color family. I went in with the lighter color first, and then I'm adding some detail marks with the darker. I'm not worrying about shading or making these smooth. I like seeing the texture of my pencil on these shells. It kind of gives them some texture, just like they would be found in real life, because they're not always super smooth. And for most of these, I'm just kind of adding those marks as if it was shading. You can see like those one shell, it's from the bottom, the scallop shells. The other shell I pulled from the sides to make them look rounded. That conch shell I did towards the bottom, and these spiral ones, I'm just adding a little bit in each of those little pieces of the shell. And then this shell, which I do not know the name of, I'll have to ask my friend Jen because she's the mermaid seashell expert. I added some little line details, which I think is kind of fun. And this is sort of the way you see these kind of shells in the wild. So now my shells are all done and I can go back to my card base. I decided I needed some shimmer and to sort of distress this up a little bit more. So what I'm doing is taking my white metallic watercolor and that very, very pale gold, and I'm just adding some splatters. And I'm trying to do my splatters from the top right corner down towards the bottom left, because that's sort of where my shells are going to go. They're going to make a diagonal across this card. And I picked that really pale gold so that it did not stand out too much. I wanted that shimmer to be very subtle in the background. Now I've taken some of those thin foam strips, I've added little pieces all over to the back of my letters, and I'm just placing this here just as a placeholder, and then you can see this is super speed. I'm figuring out where all my shells are going to go. I'm trying to make sure that I vary them so that I get one of each shape on each side of the sentiment above and below. And then I'm just moving them around to make them fit nicely with each other. It's almost like figuring out puzzle pieces to make it look really nice and fill in the spaces. So now that I have those figured out where I want them to go, I'm pulling off the liner paper on the back of my letters, and then I'm just putting that on there first. I like this background with the stripes because it makes it really easy to make sure that those letters are nice and straight. You can just use those lines between the stripes as a guide to make sure your letters are nice and straight. And then I'm going through with each of these shells, picking them up, adding a thin foam square. So this is half the thickness of the foam that is behind the letters. And I'm just putting each of these back in place where I had figured out their placement before. Once I have all of these in place, I will take my scissors and trim off the ones that overhang the edges. And I forgot to mention earlier, this is sort of inspired by a doormat that I saw at Target. It had lots of dark blue and teal shells, but they were all over that craft background, and I think that would be fun to do as well. Now finally, I have some little embellishments to fill in some of those spaces between the shells. I took the tiniest heart from the Hearts and Stars Skinny Tag die set and cut those 5 little hearts from some rainforest cardstock. And I'm just dropping those in those little voids left between some of the shells, and I think that helps fill it in nicely and give you a little more color depth. Now I'm taking that really pale gold that I used for the background, and I'm adding some little gold details to those sort of spiral shaped shells. But it wasn't quite shiny enough for me, so now I'm pulling out the stickles glitter and adding just some glitter details to all of these shells. I'm just adding this glitter here and there. I'm not covering the whole shell, so we just have a little bit of glitter accents. I'm also going to add some to those little tiny hearts as well. And then here is my finished card. When I pick that up and turn it in the light, you can see that really subtle shimmer of the metallic watercolor in the background, which I think is really fun. And I just love this fun technique of white embossing on colored cardstock and then adding detail. I think this would be really fun to do in all the colors of the rainbow and make like a whole set of cards. So I hope this has inspired you to try this out. Thanks so much for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.